Hello everyone, my name is John Sierra and I am a Tolkien scholar, and here we are for part 3, final part of my Tolkien Iceberg video. And I do have to apologize for the second part lacking music. As I was sitting down to record this third and final part, I realized, did I put music in the previous two parts? And I looked at the second one, and I wanted it to be consistent, right? And it didn't have music, so I was like, okay, well, did I put it in the first one? And then I saw there was music in the first one, so already inconsistent, but I brought the music back. So let's talk about the lower portions of this this great iceberg. Let's bring it up. Okay, it's not showing. There it is. Okay. All right, so let's talk about this. Gimli met Aule. Aule is, of course, the Vala that created the dwarves, right? He created the dwarves. I talked about that last time. Did Gimli meet him? We certainly know that Gimli, along with Legolas, sailed west, seeking Valinor, and that this grace was given to Gimli, probably through the insistence of elves like Legolas, who was coming to Valinor, and he's certainly allowed to, and Galadriel would have certainly welcomed him there. The authority of that likely came from one of the Ainur, though. Definitely Gandalf would have vouched for him, and either Manwë or Aule would have definitely said yes, absolutely. Gimli was 262 years old at this point, so he was very old. Even by dwarven standards, their average lifespan's about 250, so he lived long. Did he meet Aule? It's possible. I think that he would have liked to have met Aule. I think Aule would have liked to have met him. I don't know if it happened, but it's certainly a fun thing to think about. Sam died at sea and never met Frodo again. That's a sad theory that some people have, and I have to reject it, and I'll tell you why. Because unlike Legolas, who constructed his own ship and brought himself and Gimli to Valinor, Sam went to seek the Grey Havens. That's the last we heard of Sam. He sought the Grey Havens at Lindon, and in a city called Mithlond. So the fact that he was going there meant that if he boarded a ship, it would have been one of Círdan's ships, and Círdan's ships are not so easily smashed up or capsized or anything. And I don't think that there's rough conditions along the straight path as well, I have to say. That would be kind of odd. I don't think that Ossa would do that, to make the straight path off of the planet to be choppy like that. So I don't really subscribe to that one. All right, let's talk about the Lord of the Rings musical. Okay, it was a stage play. It was shown, I think, twice in Canada. I think you might be able to find footage of it online, but there was indeed a stage play that was a musical based on the Lord of the Rings. It was a Canadian production, so you could look into that if you'd like. Legolas's canon hair color. Okay, so Tolkien almost never mentions hair color, unless it's somewhat important, right? And if we look at the Fellowship, we know Gandalf has gray hair, right? We know that Boromir has black hair. Aragorn, not too sure about, right? The Hobbits, not too sure. You know what I mean? Some people like to say, oh, Frodo was actually blonde. It's never mentioned, the hair color. Gimli is always depicted with red hair. I don't think they ever mentioned it in the books, but that just became the way it is. And then we get to Legolas. Legolas is almost always in our modern time depicted as blonde, and I think that there is a misunderstanding that most elves are in fact blonde, and that's actually not the case. There are blonde elves, of course. Galadriel, 100% blonde, right? But even with Galadriel, it was considered unusual that she was blonde because her family was not. So, was Legolas blonde? It's never mentioned. I personally always prefer to imagine Legolas as having jet black hair. And a lot of the art that you see from artists who depicted Legolas prior to the films, and by that I mean prior to even the the Ralph Bakshi film that portrayed Legolas as blonde, he had darker hair a lot of the time, since some people were drawing him as blonde. Does he have a canon hair color? No, he doesn't. He doesn't have a canon hair color. Like I said, there are certain characters where their hair color is important. We know that Arwen has dark hair. We know that Faramir has dark hair. We know that Éomer and Éowyn have light hair. Those are kind of important. It's mentioned that Gollum has hair, very little hair, but he has hair. Does it mention what color it is? No. So, who really knows? Sauron's original name. Now, this one you have to dig deep for because it's actually not mentioned where you think it would be mentioned. It's not mentioned in the Silmarillion, rather. You would have to look into the history of Middle-earth to find that Sauron's original name was Mairon, which means the Admirable. He became known by the elves as either Sauron or Gorthaur. Sauron meaning abhorred, Gorthaur meaning cruel. Elf reincarnation. I spoke about this already. Elves. Reincarnation is... I think that it's an accurate word when we break it down. The elves are made out of sort of two separate things, their body and their spirit, right? The spirit is what's known as a Fea. And a Fea is the spirit of the elf, while the body of an elf is called a Hroa. And together you have an elf, right? Hroa without Fea is a dead body. Fea without Hroa is what they call a houseless elf. Sort of like how we refer to the bodies of the Ainur as being raiment, clothing to them. So too you can say that the body of an elf is its house, its home, right? The only difference is they're born that way. They awaken that way. They're born that way. They're not technically incarnates, because for incarnate, they have to be a spirit that is bound to a body, and that if they lose the body, they would reincarnate. They would become an incarnate again with a new body, or a copy of the old body, as is the case with the elves. In this case, I have to say it sounds accurate, but I guess it's really not, because re-embodiment is the correct term, because they're not incarnates to begin with. Though in the popular culture version of reincarnate of a person dying and their soul going to another body, I think, do you consider the soul to be the elf and the body to be a raiment? Or do you consider the elf to be made out of body and soul? And I think Tolkien's intention was likely that the elf was body and soul. The Ainur were soul only. The body was like clothing to give them shape and hue. But with an elf, the Hroa alone is referred to as houseless. So it's missing something. Whereas with an Ainur, or an Ainu, because that's the singular form, the spirit alone without the body is not referred to as houseless, but as naked, right? It's the true naked form, just without clothing. There's a big difference between describing something as without clothing and without house. So I think that distinction, to me, would say that the elves are not truly spirits that are incarnated, but that they are made up of spirit and body, much like the other children of Iluvatar, because men have souls as well. Okay. Houseless elves, we just talked about this. I didn't even see that it was the next thing, but there you go, I already explained houseless elves. The thriller Lort sequel? Lord of the Rings. I usually see it with a little O and a little R, and I always try to make great pains to talk about The Lord of the Rings, because that's the actual title, not Lord of the Rings, but The Lord of the Rings. But okay, so anyway, the thriller sequel. Okay, so I believe that what he's referring to here is, well, I don't know if the person who made this is a he or she, so we'll say what they're referring to here is a Russian novel that was a sequel to The Lord of the Rings. Although they could also be referring to The New Shadow, which is something that Tolkien started writing as a sequel to The Lord of the Rings. He didn't get very far. He started writing it. It was about King Eldarion, who is Aragorn and Arwen's son, and his adventures fighting like some sort of new shadow, a new cult that would arise, a cult of evil. And Tolkien decided that it was sort of really depressing and not worth writing or reading, and he abandoned it. I believe that you can see the entire text of it. There is an excerpt. I believe it is the entirety of The New Shadow as it was started by Tolkien in the history of Middle-earth. The Thinking Fox. Okay, so this refers to a part early on in The Lord of the Rings. Now, The Lord of the Rings, we think of it as 3 books, right? But really, it's 6 books across 3 volumes. The volume is what you get. And you can get it as 1 volume, too, right? There are I think I have a copy of The Lord of the Rings up there. It doesn't belong to me, actually, but I think it's stored up there. Mine is in 3 volumes. Mine is just out of reach. Oh, it's right over there. Damn. Well, I showed it in a previous video. My copy is 3 volumes. You can get it as 1 volume, but it's 6 books, right? Each volume being 2 books. So that's when I refer to book 2. I'm not referring to the 2 Towers. I'm referring to the latter half of the Fellowship of the Ring. So that being said, book 1 which is everything up to the Ford of Bruinen when Frodo arrives at not at Elrond's place, but at the borders of Rivendell, and he goes across the Ford of Bruinen, and the Nazgul follow, and they are swept away by a wave, and Frodo passes out. And then we go to book 2, which is in Rivendell. Starts in Rivendell anyway. So looking at it, book 1 is very similar in its writing style and its tone to The Hobbit. You could tell that it's different. It's a different writing style because we're going from Bilbo's storytelling style to Frodo's storytelling style, but it's still kind of whimsical. There's danger, but there's not a lot of bleakness. Not yet, anyway. We have things that happen that sort of feel like this is the natural sequel to The Hobbit. It has grown with its audience, certainly, but at the same time, it has a lot of the things that are more of The Hobbit than The Lord of the Rings as we think of them. And one of those is the Thinking Fox. So there's a point in the story, shortly after leaving Crickhollow, we have Frodo, Sam, and Pippin. And they sort of fall asleep slightly off of the road in the grass. And it's described that a fox comes by and sniffs them and then moves on, but that we are privy to the fox's thoughts. And the fox thinks to itself, 3 hobbits traveling in this area? That's odd. There's something going on here, you know? Now, realistically, why would that be there, right? Because the story, as we know it, is being told by Frodo, and he's asleep. Now, obviously, there are parts of The Lord of the Rings that do not concern Frodo, where he's not the focal point. There's parts where Sam is the focal point, or Merry is the focal point, or Pippin is the focal point, or Gandalf is the focal point, or Aragorn is the focal point. But in this case, the focal point is an omniscient narrator telling us the thoughts of a fox. How does Frodo know that a fox sniffed him and Sam and Pippin? And how would he know what the fox was thinking? How would the author know that, and how would Tolkien have translated that? So it's sort of an oddity, right? And there are a lot of oddities in book 1 and book 2 as well. We get Legolas talking to rocks, we get Legolas walking on snow, but those things can be explained as things that Frodo observed, or in the case of other focal characters, things that they observed but that were later relayed to Frodo. For example, one thing that we don't get in The Lord of the Rings is an account of what happened to Boromir until way later when Merry and Pippin tell the story. Because nobody was there that lived except for Merry and Pippin, so it's later when we catch up with them that they tell the story of what happened. So, The Thinking Fox is sort of an oddity. It's definitely, if we're to accept the sort of like mythology and that it's Tolkien translating works from Frodo and Bilbo and Sam, we can say that that he put a little something in there to make it whimsical. There's really no reason for the Thinking Fox, but it's there. It's there. It's one of the oddest parts of book 1. And yes, I am counting Tom Bombadil. Okay. What are the nameless things? Well, how can you answer something like that? When you think about what are the nameless things, they don't have a name. That's what they're called, the nameless, because nobody knows what they are. They don't even have a name. So it's mentioned by Gandalf that there are nameless things that gnaw at the bones of Arda. And the bones of Arda, the earth, the bones of the earth refers to deep down in the earth. There are these tunnels that are dug by something of whose nature we are unaware. He also mentions that there are nameless things in the depths of the sea. And I think what Gandalf was referring to was not specific creatures that we don't have a name for, because if we knew of them, we would come up with a name for them. But he's saying that there are things in the world that are not explainable with the knowledge that we currently have. There are tunnels far down deep, and we don't know what made them. Something made them, for they're not natural, they're dug. So they were something, some nameless thing. There are things down in the deep that we can't interact with because the pressure down there is so great, and they don't exactly have bathyspheres in Arda. So whatever's down there is nameless, it's unknown. So I think when Gandalf refers to the nameless things, he's not necessarily referring to some sort of Lovecraftian horrors that exist in the depths of the sea or the bones of the earth, but referring to just the unknown, that there's something down there, but we don't know what it is. Or there was something down there at one point that created these tunnels, and we're unaware of what they were and what their nature was. What is the Watcher? So the Watcher is referencing a sea creature that was in the lake right outside of Moria's West Gate, the one that once faced Eregion. And it was just sleeping there. Boromir started chucking rocks into the water. Frodo was like, I really wish you wouldn't do that. And then the sea creature came. It was probably just a giant squid, right? Because it's described as having tentacles. So that's what it is, probably. I would say it's a giant squid. It's called the Watcher because it's by the gate, and you could say that it's watching the gate, although I think it's just sleeping there and was disturbed by Boromir. Sauron killed the Entwives is certainly a theory that many have. I feel like, was this earlier? Is this a repeat? I feel like we already talked about the Entwives. Well, I don't know, there's so many things on there that I don't know, but whether or not Sauron killed the Entwives is something up for debate. Something happened. The Ents, Treebeard describes that the Ents like to stay sort of in one area. Yeah, they traveled, but they generally had a home. And at one point, the Entwives... Now, it should be mentioned that Entwives doesn't necessarily refer to any female Ent. It refers specifically to the wives of the Ents, because he also mentions Ent maidens. So it's not just Entwives, it's Ent maidens, a maiden, of course, being an unmarried woman. So, generally speaking, a younger unmarried woman with an older unmarried woman would be a maid. Anyway, semantics aside, the female Ents are, gone. They're missing, and when Treebeard says that they lost the Entwives, he says it literally. He explains that they literally don't know where they are. He does theorize that they may have come to the Old Forest near the Shire. Certainly, there are hints that Farmer Maggot had talked to Ents, or at least Huorns. Were they female? Who knows? We really don't know. This is one of the things that Tolkien refused to explain. He liked having a bit of mystery in his works. And when he was asked directly what happened to the Entwives, he said very simply that he didn't know. He fears they may have been killed, and if we look at the time period in which they vanished, it is likely that if they were killed, that it was by Sauron, because there was an area that they were last seen in by the Ents, and that area was razed by Sauron in an attempt to stave off the Last Alliance. So they could have gotten caught up in a war that they really had nothing to do with. Is that necessarily what happened? Was that all of the Entwives? Are there some surviving that are just out there somewhere? These are the things that we can't know. Treebeard seems to have hope that they are out there somewhere, and that they would absolutely love the Old Forest, which is near the Shire. It seems like, from Merry and Pippin's description of the Old Forest, that it's the type of place that Entwives and Entmaidens would really like. Dwarvish and dwarf culture. So we know very little about the language of the dwarves, which is not... Well, I guess you would say it's a dwarvish language, but it's actually called Khuzdul. And it's a language that is really only spoken by dwarves. It's possible that maybe Galadriel could have spoken it, right? Because she was a great friend of dwarves, especially in the Second Age. But their culture, their secret names, everything about them is kind of insular. They show themselves to other people. They speak with other peoples. They trade with other peoples. They make friendships with other peoples. But they still have that side of them, their private side, that they don't share with anybody. So yeah, there's a big mystery there, obviously. Dagor-Dagoroth translates to Battle of Battles. And it's a prophecy that was initially intended by Tolkien to be what ended the Silmarillion, if it ever got published, was that there would be a second prophecy of Mandos, who would talk about Morgoth returning from the void. Somehow he would get back through the Doors of Night. He would destroy the sun and make war upon Arda one last time. And in this great battle, a lot of the heroes of old would be resurrected, specifically talking about the heroes of men, such as Turin Tarambar, who would be the one to somehow finally permanently slay Morgoth in the final battle. And you see elements of this that did creep into the Silmarillion, but the actual prophecy, Dagor-Dagoroth, didn't make it into it. There was an earlier version where it was said that he would return for the final battle and slay Ancalagon, right? And that didn't happen. That final battle, you would say, is the final battle of the First Age then, and then that would be, that would in fact be the War of Wrath, right? So that wouldn't be at the end of the Silmarillion. It would be the end of Quenta Silmarillion, right? Before going into the Second Age section, which is a Calabeth. So Christopher Tolkien did not include Dagor-Dagoroth, the prophecy, which is sort of like a Tolkien version of, we'll say, a little bit of Revelation and a little bit of Ragnarok in there as well. Like even Ar-Pharazôn would return to fight Morgoth in this. But there was another note from Tolkien that Christopher found that stated that however the world was to end, because Dagor-Dagoroth did signify the end of Arda as we know it, and that it would be reshaped, there would be a second music of the Ainur, and then Arda would become Earth. And this would lead into our history. Everything after that would be our history, because the music would be redone without the taint of Melkor, without the discord in it. But there was a note that said that however this plays out, it is not known to the Valar. So Christopher Tolkien interpreted this as the Dagor-Dagoroth prophecy is moot. It was that J.R.R. Tolkien had changed his mind about including it, so it wasn't included. Is it true that he changed his mind? I think so. But there's room to interpret that maybe he had meant to include Dagor-Dagoroth and that it was just not known to... Maybe it was known to Mandos and maybe he didn't proclaim it to the other Valar. But I don't think that's the case, personally. Frodo was supposed to be called Bingo. Yeah, so in the earliest versions of the story, there was a character named Bingo that eventually became Frodo. There's not much to say there. Yeah, Bingo was a name that Tolkien was mulling around before he came up with Frodo. Dragon classification. So there are sort of like two important types of worms. There are a lot of worms meaning dragon in Tolkien's works, and it basically boils down to the ones that fly and the ones that don't, right? The original dragons didn't fly. They were like giant lizards that walked on the earth, and they could emit fire, and they could emit a foul stench, and they were very, very great and powerful. Glaurung was the first of these, called the father of all dragons, and Calagon the Black was an example of the first example of a winged dragon, of the likes of which you would later see Smaug as a winged dragon. But that's basically all there is about that. Legolas's birthday, we have no idea when Legolas was born. There's so little about his personal life and his family that we don't know. We know that Legolas had a father whose name was Thranduil, who was the king of Mirkwood, and we know that he had a grandfather, his father's father, who was Orifur, who died in the Battle of the Last Alliance at the Siege of Barad-dûr. But that's it. That's all we know. What is his mother's name? What is Legolas's mother's name? Who knows? When was he born? Who knows? Does he have any brothers or sisters? Who knows? Does he have any aunts or uncles? Who knows? What's his age? We don't know. We don't even know his hair color, as I mentioned earlier. So that being said, Legolas is definitely the most mysterious member of the Fellowship, in the sense that we don't know much about him. So yeah, his birth date is a big question mark. And actually this doesn't go in. This is something else. Mother names, father names, and after names. So sometimes elves have multiple names, and you may see, because usually it's one name, right? Like Feanor, Glorfindel, Elrond, right? And then sometimes you hear of an elf that sort of has a first name and a last name, but a first name and a second name, right? Like Arwen Undumil. And it's not like a first name and a surname, like a given name and a surname. Undumil is not her family name, because her father is not Elrond Undumil. Her mother is not Celebrian Undumil. Her brothers are not Elladan Undumil and Elrohir Undumil. That's not the way that works. Elves get a name that is given to them by their fathers, and they get a name that is given to them by their mothers, and they sort of choose which one they want to go by. The after name is what we get in Dumiel, is not so much a given name, but sort of like a title, right? Like that's how we get Elrond Half-Elven. He's half-elven in the sense that he has human ancestry, but that doesn't mean that all half-elves are called that, right? Because his father was Earendil, who was also half-elf, and we don't hear of Earendil half-elven. So it's sort of a title given to him because Elrond is a friend to men. He is not just of human ancestry and elven ancestry, but he makes that very much part of his being. Arwen Undumil means the even star. So it's sort of like a title given to her, sort of like Luthien Tinuviel meaning morning star, or sometimes twilight star, depending on how you translate it. So that's what an aftername is. Feanor did nothing wrong. Okay, this is the sort of thing that when people say this on Quora, I usually delete the comment, and if they keep posting it, I may even block them, because it sort of reminds me of a meme I saw where it was like, I don't know, Terminator 2, where the Terminator is with John Connor, and he calls the parents to find out if they're okay. And he says, "What's his dog's name?" And I forget the dog's name, but he does John Connor's voice to the mother and purposefully says, because he hears the dog barking, the incorrect name of the dog, right? He says like Woofy or something. And the mother, if it really was the mother and not a Terminator, would have said, "That's not the dog's name. What are you doing? You know that's not the dog's name." But instead, she's like, "Oh, no, he's fine. Wolfie's fine, right?" And he just hangs it up and goes, "Your parents are dead." And in the meme, it was like, instead of the dog, it was, "Did your parents read the Silmarillion?" And John Connor's like, yeah, I think they did. And he's like, "Yeah, Mom, I was thinking about how Feanor killed those Teleri elves and how terrible that was." And the mother's like, "Feanor did nothing wrong. The Teleri elves should have just given them their ships if they didn't want to be killed." And he hangs up and he goes, "Your parents are alive and they're terrible people." Yeah, saying Feanor did nothing wrong, or the next one, Melkor did nothing wrong. Melkor is the evil. He's the Lucifer, the Satan of the Tolkien universe. So to say he did nothing wrong is kind of wild. You can make the interpretation that everything he did was Iluvatar's will, but that doesn't mean that it was right morally. It's only that he's incapable of doing anything that falls outside of Iluvatar's will, and being told that, he only took it as a challenge. "Oh, I'll do something." Feanor, he did good things. He did bad things. And in the end, the bad sort of outweighed the good. killing the Teleri elves, the kinslaying's unforgivable, really. It shouldn't have happened. Build your own ships if you really want to go to Middle-earth. That's what I would have said, right? Build your own ships. But he, that oath was horrible. Anybody who says Feanor did nothing wrong is being a disingenuous jerk, I would say. Aragorn's tax policy. Oh man. Okay, so I believe that it's a meme, right? They don't really talk about taxes all that much, or ever in the Lord of the Rings. And I'm getting texted, and I want to make sure that this is nothing that I need to worry about. So let me whip out my phone. Hopefully this is nothing that I need to stop the video here. How come I don't see it? Oh, that's group chat. I can ignore that. Okay. So anyway, what was I up to? We were talking about Aragorn's tax policy. They don't really mention taxes in The Lord of the Rings. I believe this was a quote from George R.R. Martin, who sort of likes to playfully snipe at Tolkien's work. He's a fan of Tolkien's work, but he likes to, Gandalf should have stayed dead. What's Aragorn's tax policy? To quote J.R.R. Tolkien, shut up. I might have to splice in him saying that there. I probably won't bother, because I think it's only audio. I don't think there's video of that. Anyway, yeah, shut up, right? Bilbo's party mirrors Frodo's journey. How? This is a weird one, right? It really doesn't. There's nothing about Bilbo's party that mirrors Frodo's journey. It's kind of bizarre. Houseless elves, didn't we already talk about that? Yeah, you could see it's here, and it's also here. It looks like they decided that houseless elves was going to be in this section, but maybe they wrote it here and decided to paste it over here next to elf reincarnation and forgot to delete it there. They hit copy paste instead of cut and paste. All right, what are the Silmarils made of? They're made out of an element called Silmarilli, which is known only to Feanor. He discovered it, and he was the only one that could work with it and knew where it was. It was said that it would be discovered after Dagor-Dagorath, or during it, perhaps. But that's why he was the only one that can make Silmarils. What would be the actual make of them? I don't know. Because I talked about Mithril sort of being like titanium. I don't know what Silmarilli would be like, because it's something that is only ever made into 3 gems, so we don't know. The animated movies, this was definitely in one of the earlier ones, in one of the upper sections. He talked about the Ashcan Hobbit, the Rankin Bass Hobbit, the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings, and the Rankin Bass Return of the King. I know we talked about that. The real reason Tuor was sent to Gondolin. Now this is a really interesting thing. So the coming of Tuor to Gondolin is a story. It's not in the Silmarillion. We know that Tuor came to Gondolin, but if you want to read the story of how that happened, you have to pick up Unfinished Tales. And Unfinished Tales tells this really fun story about Tuor coming to Gondolin. And what happens is he wanders to the sea, and he sees the gulls, and he's instilled with the sea longing, which is unusual because he's not an elf, he's a man. And Tuor actually later became the only human to become an elf, to be counted among the Eldar. There are elves that became men. We know that, right? Arwen, for example, gave up her immortality. Luthien, same thing. But in the case of Tuor, it was the opposite, and it was only by the special grace of Iluvatar that he was able to become immortal and to abide in Aman at the end of his story. But we're talking about sort of the beginning of his story. He comes and he meets Ulmo, the Vala Ulmo, the king of the seas, and Ulmo gives him the mission to go to Gondolin and to speak to the king of Gondolin, Thingol, and to speak his words, meaning Ulmo's words, through the vessel that is Tuor. And Tuor is not allowed to go to Gondolin because he is not an elf, and but he does, and he comes there, and he comes to abide there because he does speak those words. He picks up the armor that was left there, and the cloak given to him by Ulmo, and he travels with an elf that had shipwrecked there, and they get to Gondolin. It's a really fun story. But what was the true purpose, right? So, I think the real reason. So there is a theory about this that the whole point was Ulmo's great foresight, and that with a man coming to Gondolin, that Tuor would not only come to live with the elves, but that he would marry Idril, who is an elf, and that this would lead to Earendil, because that's what it did lead to, right? And Earendil, being with human ancestry at the time, if one of your parents was an elf and the other was human, you're human, you're mortal, right? But Earendil did something that was forbidden for men to do, and he went to the Undying Lands, and he petitioned for Manwë to intervene in the first stage politics, and that's what led to the War of Wrath. That's what led to Morgoth's defeat. But it was said that Earendil should be killed because he came to the Undying Lands, which was forbidden under pain of death. However, Manwë said he had elven ancestry, and so in this case, he would be spared because he is the child of an elf. But he had to choose. And so all of Earendil's progeny beyond that, who were part elf and part man, all had a choice to make, whether they would be counted among the Eldar or among the Edain, whether they would be elves or they would be men. And we see instances like Elrond and Elros, with Elrond choosing to be an elf and Elros choosing to be a man. So I believe that sending Tuor there, Ulmo was showing great foresight, because it was Earendil that got Manwë to send Eanwa and as the herald towards Beleriand and lead to the defeat of Morgoth. Okay. All right, what do we have next? Ungoliant used to serve Vaera? Probably not, no. Ungoliant is a not a Maya, probably, right? We don't know what Ungoliant really is, but probably not a Maya, probably just a spirit of discord, right? Something that is maybe a product of Morgoth's music, or Melkor's music, which makes her sort of outside the purview of Iluvatar's creations, and she eventually took the form of a great spider, but the only Vala she ever served was Melkor. Elf propaganda. I see this sometimes, especially in relation to The Hobbit. If you criticize Thorin, you're like, it's elf propaganda. I've actually been accused of that. I think it's silly, but whatever. Unreliable narrators. I mean, I kind of touched on this a little bit with the Thinking Fox. My thoughts on the Thinking Fox, or how reliable are the narrators? We know that Bilbo was somewhat unreliable in his storytelling. He outright lied at one point. And Frodo wrote something about a fox thinking. Why would he write that? So there is an element of unreliable narrators. I brought this up once when speaking about how does Legolas walk across the surface of snow without sinking in. How is that possible? Well, he doesn't really walk. In the movie, he runs. And there was a whole discussion on Twitch with Professor Corey Olson, and he was sort of leaning towards this was sort of a mistake. Tolkien shouldn't have done this because it's just very, very bizarre, and that there's a lot of things about Legolas that are just very strange, even by Elven standards, and that it was something that the sort of thing that he would maybe mock C.S. Lewis for including, just something that he thought was cool or that his children thought was cool. My thought on it is that's what Frodo thought he saw, right? From Frodo's angle, and when he's writing the story, it's a few years later, he thought he saw Legolas make no footprint. That's my thought on it. So, Tolkien translated The Lord of the Rings. We talked about this a little bit already, but Tolkien always said he didn't write the stories, he translated them. Bilbo wrote The Hobbit, Frodo and Sam wrote The Lord of the Rings. The elves wrote the Silmarillion, and Bilbo translated it, and then he retranslated it all into English. It's all like a joke. It's his tongue-in-cheek sort of idea, right? Because it was never his intention to write novels. It was his intention to write mythology. So it's sort of like, oh, I found these works of our past and I'm translating it, right? It didn't really happen. It is fiction, but it's sort of a funny thing to talk about. Okay. Gil-galad's family tree. Gil-galad, this is a complicated one. I'm going to try and simplify it as much as possible. Originally, Gil-galad was thought to be a son of Finrod, which Finrod is Galadriel's oldest brother. And Tolkien changed his mind and decided that Finrod never had a wife and was childless. So then he changed it to Gil-galad was Fingon's son. And that's actually what wound up in the published Silmarillion. However, if you look at the way that elven politics of ascension of the High Kingdom of the Noldor work, in the instance that a king dies, not that happens often because they are elves, the kingship would fall to his oldest male heir. And if he doesn't have any male heirs or doesn't have any heirs at all, it would go to the next in line that is a relative of his. So it might go to a brother or a cousin or a nephew, right? So if Gil-galad was in fact the son of Fingon, then Gil-galad would have been next in line to be king rather than Turgon. But Turgon was king first, and then after Turgon died, it became Gil-galad. So it doesn't make sense, right? And Christopher Tolkien stated basically that he realized that it didn't really make a lot of sense, but that to change it, he would have to do a lot of revision of the Silmarillion, that he was not comfortable with this. It would basically force him to make a creative decision. And if we look at Christopher Tolkien's work, he's not really an author in the way that his father was. He was a translator like his father. He was an editor, an excellent editor, I might add. But he didn't write fiction, generally. So he would have to do some actual writing, and he didn't really want to meddle with his father's work. And he didn't want to write fiction in that sense, so he kept it in there. Later on, in one of the History of Middle-earth, I believe it was the Peoples of Middle-earth, he did say that this was an error, and that Gil-galad's father's name was, I want to say Ondifer? And I think it was Ondifer. I don't want to confuse him with Orifer, which was Thranduil's father, but I think it was Ondifer. So that's where Gil-galad came from. So there is an error in the Silmarillion in relation to Gil-galad's parentage, but we could chalk that up in universe as just Bilbo screwed up, right? Bilbo screwed up. Anytime there's an error, Bilbo screwed up. Blame it on Bilbo. Okay, where are we up to? Melkor was the good guy. No, he wasn't. The Tolkien Ensemble. Okay, so the Tolkien Ensemble is, I believe they're a band. I believe that they're a band, and they're from, they're Danish. They're from the Netherlands. Not the Netherlands. They're Danish. And Netherlands would be Dutch. They are Danes. And they put out musical versions, I should say, of the songs and poems that are in The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion. So basically what they do is they set those to music. And they put out a few albums. I believe that's the Tolkien Ensemble. Frodo lived in Tol Eressëa. Maybe, maybe not. There's no way to know. Some people like to say... Okay, so there was sort of one of Tolkien's essays was greatly misunderstood, in which he wrote that human life is fleeting in Valinor. And what he was talking about was from the perspective of the immortals, the elves, and especially from the perspective of the eternal, the Ainur, that human lives are just like that to them. There's a human there, and then he's not. That's what it's like to them. It's like a blip. So, this was misinterpreted by a lot of people to believe that Valinor was deadly to humans and that you would die faster, right? There is a little bit of a basis for interpreting this way based on what was said to Numenor, that their flames would burn out faster if they lived there. But I think that was because the elves and the Ainur are so unchanging. It's from their perspective, right? They're not meant to be there. Frodo, of course, was given special grace along with Bilbo, Sam, and Gimli. And of course, Tuor, but he became an elf. He became immortal. They did not. So Tol Eressëa was the island that Ulmo pushed across the Sundering Seas, the Belagir Sea, to bring the elves from Middle-earth, the original Great Voyage from Middle-earth to Aemon. Aemon is the main continent. Eressëa is an island off the coast of it. Valinor is but one of a few different countries in Aemon, and that's specifically where the Valar are. But there's other places like Eldamar, for example. Eressëa is also sort of, some people call it purgatorial, because Tolkien used the word purgatorial as a metaphor for specifically the Noldor exiles who decided, they weren't told that they couldn't enter Aemon, they weren't told that they couldn't be in Valinor, they were in fact told that they were welcome back, but that they decided to dwell in Eressëa. And that was by choice. But as for Frodo, there are no holy death rays coming from the Valinor, from the Valar in Valinor that would make your life shorter. Now, some people said, well, the Silmarils shortened Lúthien's life. Maybe, yes, wearing the light directly on her breast might have shortened her life, right? But that's like hugging the two trees of Valinor, right? That's like having the sun right here, right? The mother of the sun, as well as the father of the moon. So that's a little different than just abiding in Aemon. Maybe Frodo wound up in Eressëa. Maybe he ended up in Aldemar or Valinor or any other part of Aemon. We don't know. And it's impossible to know. And we should stop saying they definitely did that, because there's nothing in Tolkien's writings that say that. Okay, now this is a weird one. Wagner inspiration. I don't think that there's anything in Tolkien's works that was inspired by Wagner's operas. And I'll tell you why I think that. Tolkien didn't like Wagner's operas. He didn't speak much of music in regards to what he liked. I think he said he liked certain classical pieces, he liked Gregorian chants, but he specifically disliked rock and roll, blues, jazz, and specifically Wagner's operas. He did not like them. So I don't see inspiration there from something that he hated. All right, are we moving down to the final? Is this the final? Yes, this is the end of it. Okay, we're going to get through this. The Last Ring Bearer was a Russian novel. It was written by a guy named Eskov, and basically it's a retelling of The Lord of the Rings told from the perspective of the villains. And, like Sauron, for example. And it makes them out to be the heroes who are trying to bring technology and industrialization to Middle-earth, while Gandalf is sort of this Luddite who is trying to stop progress from happening. Oh no, Angbang. You know what? A lot of these memes in the bottom section, there'll be one that'll randomly say, do not, like in all caps with an exclamation point, it'll say, do not research. And it's sort of just a meme, right? That you'll just randomly put that on. And if I was doing this, I would have put that on Angbang. So, Angbang is derived from Angband, which was the name of the fortress that Morgoth had in the First Age. Bang, in relation to relations, we'll say. So, it is the shipping name of Morgoth and Sauron. If you don't know what shipping name is, well, let's just say that there's people on the internet that say, when they make a cute couple, let's draw a whole lot of pictures of them making out. So, and I'm gonna say that, you might want to turn safe search on, but just go to Google image search and don't type in Angbang, but type in Morgoth and Sauron. Or, if you're really saucy, put in their real names, type in Melkor and Myron, and you will see many pictures of them holding hands, or hugging, or kissing, or, embracing each other. Sometimes Morgoth is kissing the top of Sauron's head, So, it's become like kind of popular thing among artists, especially on Tumblr, to depict them in a romantic relationship, and the shipping name is Angbang, because they're from Angband and they're banging. The Russian movies. So there were, like I said, there were Russian novels. There were also Russian movies. Russia has, I'm going to say, a unique perspective on copyright. A very unique perspective on copyright. Of course, we already talked about The Last Ring Bearer. There are other Russian novels, some of which are sequels to The Lord of the Rings. I don't think that Tolkien would have a problem with that. I don't think that he was all into the idea of intellectual property. I think he liked the idea of other authors telling stories in his legendarium. I think he would have liked to have been asked permission, but he's gone. So those exist. They're in Russian. The Finnish adaptation. Okay, so the Finnish adaptation is called Hobbiti, or The Hobbits. It was a miniseries that aired on television in Finland in, I want to say, the late 90s. And it was Lord of the Rings told as a miniseries. The Finrod Rock Opera is a stage show in Russia. We're going back to Russia again. It's a play based on Finrod. Finrod, of course, being Galadriel's older brother who battled Sauron. From what I've heard, I certainly don't know Russian, so I don't know what's going on. But from what I've heard, it wasn't very true to the source material. They did a second one called The Lay of Luthien, which was based on Beren and Luthien, and I heard that one was better. Also in Russian, though, so I couldn't tell you firsthand. The Hobbits traveled in time. No, you're confusing that with the movie... oh god, what was that movie called with the dwarves and the map and the time machine? Time Bandits. It was Time Bandits. Yeah, no. Hobbits didn't travel through time. That's silly. Hollow Earth, real Middle Earth, actual conspiracy theory. Oh, so some people have misinterpreted that Middle Earth means that it was in the middle of Earth, and this ties into this really old sort of like quack theory about the Hollow Earth, and that there's like a whole society, a whole world below the crust of the earth. Middle Earth is derived from Midgard, which translates to middle yard, basically meaning that it is the center of the cosmology, but also translates to dwelling of man, because Middle Earth is not the planet. Middle Earth is a continent on the planet, which is called Arda, which literally, by the way, Arda means earth. Okay, it's not like a different name for the Earth, it's a different translation of the word Earth. So, Middle Earth being, this is where the men dwell. That's the way that Tolkien was using it, like Midgard being where men dwelled in Norse mythology. Sam Lockfield's score. He did the soundtrack to the Silmarillion, and you're thinking, what soundtrack to the Silmarillion? Look it up on YouTube. It's actually really cool. He made basically reading music for the Silmarillion. Like, this is music you play when you read this part. This is music you read when you play that part. Personally, I don't like this sort of thing, and this is just like a me thing. I don't like to have music playing while I'm reading because it splits my attention too much, but a lot of people really like having reading music, and if you're the type of person that likes having reading music and you want it for the Silmarillion, just go into that YouTube search function and type in Stan Lockfield, and you'll find it. Sauron was a cat boy, Tevildo. So, yeah. So Tevildo was a character who was literally a cat, an evil cat, that was in the very earliest drafts of the Legendarium. And you could read about this in the Book of Lost Tales, in the history of Middle-earth. And eventually he became a character who wasn't a cat, called Thu the Necromancer. And then eventually that was folded into Gorthaur the Cruel, or Sauron. So it wasn't that Sauron was a cat boy, or that's a funny way of putting it, but that Sauron replaced another character that at one point was a cat. Fairies, gnomes, and elves. Okay, so what's interesting is in the very earliest versions of The Hobbit, the High Elves were referred to as gnomes, which is derived from gnosis, which is sort of like where you would get that from, but Tolkien found that people hear the term gnome, and you'll see this a lot in the history of Middle-earth, referring to High Elves as gnomes. They think of short, squat, bearded, like a garden gnome, like a dwarf, right? So he decided to just call them High Elves. Fairies. There weren't a whole lot of fairies in the Lord of the Rings. There was something called Fae. And that's also something that you could read about in the Book of Lost Tales. There's Fae or sprites. In the very early drafts, they were removed. Bilbo does mention in The Hobbit someplace called Faerie, which is also referred to as the Perilous Realm. And it basically means Aemon, the Undying Lands, where men are not supposed to go. And that's why Bilbo says, to the west to Faerie. He's talking about Valinor. He's talking about the Undying Lands. Okay, the Watcher is Cthulhu. Oh, I'm skipping some stuff here. Okay, so this I don't know. So that first symbol there, this here, I know I've seen this before in, I think it's part of the Icelandic alphabet, and I think it's like a th sound. I think. I'm not sure on that, but I believe that that's what it is greater than S. Or I think maybe what this person is trying to say that for S sounds in The Lord of the Rings, this is the preferred character, so that S sounds might be more like TH sounds, like, I don't know. Does that mean that Thorin would be Englished as Sorin, or that Syrian would be Englished as Thirion? I'm really not sure the point that's being made here. No. Anyway, moving on. Mermaids and nymphs are more early Legendarium stuff. They didn't make it into, like, the Silmarillion, but you could read about them in the Book of Lost Tales, which is the very earliest drafts of Legendarium. The Watcher is Cthulhu. We kind of mentioned this earlier. The Watcher is probably a giant squid. Tolkien was probably aware of Lovecraft's work, but he certainly wouldn't put Cthulhu in a lake outside of Moria, Nobody went insane. Let me just make this a little... Okay. The nameless things are Lovecraftian monsters. I already said they're not. They're not. They're just things that don't have names, that we don't know their nature. Pointy ears. Ooh, this is a big one. Okay, did the elves have pointy ears? No, they did not. Now, in one of the writings in the history of Middle-earth, I believe it might have been the Peoples of Middle-earth, it is mentioned that a specific type of elves, and I believe it was specifically the Noldor, had what Christopher Tolkien put as leaf-shaped ears, right? Which you might interpret as being pointy. However, there are many types of leaves, and it may have been just saying that these specific elves had ears that were different from other specific types of elves. Generally speaking, Tolkien was pretty clear that there is no physical distinction between humans, mortals, men, and elves. That they are physically the same, other than that the elves tend to be more beautiful, but that they don't have big pointy ears. That is something that is more of a pop culture thing. There are a lot of versions of elves out there that have pointy ears. So when you say elf, you think of pointy ears. Now, this actually got confused by a note from Tolkien himself, because there is a race in The Lord of the Rings that has pointy ears, and that's hobbits. Hobbits 100% have the big pointy ears. And the way that he described it in a note to his publisher was they had elvish ears. This doesn't mean that elves have pointy ears. This wasn't something that was meant to be in the text. This was just a note to his publisher on what hobbits look like. And that people understandably think of pointy ears and elves being together, so saying, yes, they have elvish ears. Also keeping in mind that at this point he was calling the elves, what we know as the elves, as gnomes. So, his elves are different. So yeah, no pointy ears for the elves, yes, pointy ears for hobbits. One of the Nazgul was a woman. There's no reason that is 100% untrue, although I will say it's probably like 90% untrue. When Tolkien says man or men, he generally means mortal or mortals, humans. That's what he's talking about. If he needs to refer to, let's say, Elrond as being male, he will say elfman. Or, let's say Thorin's sister, Dis, dwarf woman. Right? So you don't really see that with men, with the race of men, because you don't see man or human man. It's just man, woman. So there's a little bit of confusion there. They were definitely men in the sense that they were mortals. However, the poem says mortal men. Is that redundant? Or is he stating that they were male? There is certainly a possibility that you could have a female Nazgul. And I've actually heard that this was an interpretation that made its way into the shadow of video games, which I haven't played yet. I'm planning on playing those at some point. I do have them, but I haven't actually played them. I want to play them on Twitch. But anyway, you could certainly say that one of the Nazgul was a woman. We don't know who they were. We know one of them was the Witch King. We know another one was an Easterling named Khamul, and then there are 7 others. We don't know the names. We know that some of them were from Numenor, some of them were from Rhûn. But there's nothing to also say that there definitely was a female Nazgul either. So it's sort of one of those things that you can believe it if you'd like to, but it's probably not the case. The Black Speech is an in-world conlang created by Sauron. Yeah, of course. That shouldn't even be at the bottom. That should be closer to the top. A conlang is a constructed language. Now, you might say to yourself, what is a constructed language? Aren't all languages constructed? So a constructed language is something that is created for a specific purpose. Like Esperanto is a constructed language because it was created to be sort of a universal language that could be spoken anywhere and is not tied to a culture. Whereas English, you can see the roots of other languages and how it culturally deviated from Latin and from Germanic languages, right? And from the Romance languages like French and English and Spanish. So usually languages sort of evolve over time. Most of the languages in The Lord of the Rings are what you would call conlangs. Quenya certainly is. The Black Speech is, and Khuzdul, the language of the dwarves, definitely is. Some of them that are not would be Sindarin, Westron, and I had another one in mind, the Speech of Rohan, right? So, in the case of the Black Speech, yes, Sauron created it, and it was specifically because he was gathering together a whole lot of different Orcish tribes that all had their own Orcish tongues, and here was a language that was very attractive to orcs because it was all harsh sounds, and it sounded evil, and they liked that, and that they could all speak and communicate effectively. This really shouldn't be in the bottom. This should be closer to the top. That's a very obvious one. The ring is a key to the void. No. I mean, if that was the case, then Sauron would have been using it for that purpose, to maybe find Morgoth, instead of using it to control others. It's a control over the rings of power. It has nothing to do with the void. The nameless things cause the apocalypse. As far as there is an apocalypse, I mean, the War of Wrath was already sort of an apocalypse. The War of the Valar was sort of an apocalypse. Dagor-Dagorath, certainly an apocalypse. And that's caused by Melkor returning. Nameless things, like I said, it's just the unknown. People are putting a lot of fanciful imagination into it. And by the way, Tolkien would have loved that. He would have loved people using their imagination to come up with things like that. The Black Book of Arda. Okay, so the Black Book of Arda, isn't that the same thing as the Last Ring Bearer, or did I confuse the two? You know what? Come to think of it, I think what I described earlier as Lord of the Rings told from the villain's perspective is not the Last Ring Bearer. That's the Black Book of Arda. They're both Russian novels. I believe the Last Ring Bearer is the sequel to... Let me look this up, because I'm actually really kind of unsure on this one. I know that they're both Russian novels. Let me look up the Last Ring Bearer. Oh, let's try spelling Ring Bearer, right? Here it is on Wikipedia. It was written in 1999 by Eskov. That's what I said. It is an alternative account and an informal sequel to Lord of the Rings. Yeah, okay, so no, I was correct. So the Black Book of Arda... So apparently it's the same idea by a different Russian author? Or they're saying that it's a Russian fan fiction from 1992. Oh, I see. Okay, so The Last Ring Bearer is his version of The Lord of the Rings. The Black Book of Arda is that version of the Silmarillion. So it's told from like Melkor's perspective. Okay, I had them mixed up with each other, but I was actually correct about The Last Ring Bearer. Black Book of Arda is the same idea. It was written in Russia. I don't know if it's the same author. I suspect it might be. I'm not seeing the name of an author here for the Black Book, but That's apparently more related to the first and second age events. Okay, that's the Tolkien iceberg, or the Middle Earth iceberg, I guess we should say, explained by me. It took nearly 3 hours to do it. And on the Reddit thread, unfortunately, I can't give credit to the person that made it because the person that made it deleted their Reddit account, so I don't see their name, but thank you to whoever created this. It was really fun to go through. Somebody in the comments did say it would be cool to see a video made of this. I don't think they realized that a video would be so long and that it would be broken into 3 parts. But I do have a Reddit account, and I'm going to go back to that thread and say, hey, look, it's 2 years later, but I did do it in 3 parts. So hopefully the person who made this will find these videos, and hopefully they'll give their thoughts on it and everything. But there were a few mistakes in here. Maybe there's like a later version of this that has those mistakes, you know, where they doubled up on things, and there was one where it was like about Yavanna and it was cut off, but really good, really fun stuff. But anyway, guys, I'll see you next time with more content. Bye.